In 1619, the Virginia Colonial Assembly passed a law requiring every farmer in the settlement to grow it, not as a suggestion, as a legal obligation. Farmers who refused faced fines. The crop was so critical to the survival of the colony, for rope, for sail canvas, for clothing, for paper, that the authorities could not afford to let anyone opt out. That same crop was grown by George Washington at Mount Vernon, where he mentioned it in his diaries and letters more than 90 times. Thomas Jefferson grew it and thought it important enough to invent a specialized processing machine for it, one he deliberately refused to patent so that any farmer could use it freely. Benjamin Franklin owned a paper mill that manufactured it at scale. The sails and rigging of the Continental Navy were made from it. The USS Constitution, Old Ironsides, required more than 120,000 pounds of its fiber just for its lines and rigging. The first American flag was sewn from it. At various points in early American history, farmers were allowed to pay their taxes with it instead of currency, because the government valued it that much. For more than 300 years, this plant was not a fringe crop. It was the backbone of American agriculture, the plant that clothed the colonies, rigged the Navy, and according to Henry Ford in 1941, could power any engine on Earth. In 1937, it became effectively illegal to grow, not because it had failed, not because something better replaced it, because 3 of the most powerful men in America had just invested everything in the industries it threatened, and they had the connections to make it disappear. Today, we are going to tell the story they buried. By the time this video ends, you will understand exactly what hemp produces, how it powers engines, heats homes, and feeds families from a single quarter-acre planting. Why the 1937 ban had nothing to do with public safety and everything to do with protecting the investments of an oil baron, a newspaper magnate, and a chemical company that had just patented the synthetic alternative. And how you can legally grow this plant today and use it to cut your dependence on every supply chain that has been charging you for what this crop has always been able to provide for free. Before we dive in, comment where you are watching from and click subscribe. The plant is industrial hemp, Cannabis sativa. And before you let the association with its psychoactive cousin stop you from listening, understand this. Industrial hemp contains less than 0.3% THC, the compound that produces intoxication. You cannot get high from it. Farmers in colonial America were not growing fields of recreational drug. They were growing one of the most productive, most versatile, and most energy-dense crops ever cultivated by human beings. Hemp is among the oldest known plant fibers used by humans. Evidence of hemp rope found in ancient Chinese pottery dates back 10,000 years. Chinese agricultural texts documented hemp cultivation 5,000 years ago. The Vikings made their sail canvas from it. The English fleet that defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588 required an estimated 10,000 acres of cultivated hemp for its rigging and sails. Without hemp, there was no navy. Without a navy, there was no empire. Every maritime power on Earth understood this, which is why hemp cultivation was not just encouraged, it was legally mandated. When the English established their colonies in America, the first thing they needed was hemp. The colony at Jamestown ordered hemp cultivation in 1619, not 10 years after its founding, not as an afterthought, but as one of its first agricultural requirements. The Virginia Assembly's 1632 order required every planter to provide seed and sow it as soon as possible. Not because colonial authorities were enthusiastic about plant biodiversity, because without hemp the colony had no rope, no canvas, no rigging for its ships, and no reliable fiber for its clothing and tools. For the next 3 centuries, hemp was woven into American economic life so completely that the idea of banning it would have seemed not just radical, but catastrophic. George Washington wrote about his hemp fields throughout his career as a farmer, mentioning the crop more than 90 times in diaries and correspondence. He experimented with varieties, tracked yields carefully, and saw hemp as a genuine alternative to tobacco as a cash crop. Thomas Jefferson did the same and considered the processing of hemp so essential to rural prosperity that he spent considerable personal effort designing a specialized hemp brake, a machine for separating fiber from stalks that he deliberately refused to patent so that any farmer could use it freely. Benjamin Franklin owned a hemp paper mill that was a commercial enterprise serving one of the most information-hungry markets in the young republic. The Continental Army was clothed partly in hemp canvas. The Continental Navy was rigged entirely with hemp rope. Hemp was accepted as legal tender in colonial America starting in 1631. You could pay your taxes with it because the government valued the plant as much as it valued coin. When the United States won its independence and needed to build a navy, hemp was the strategic foundation of that fleet. The USS Constitution, Old Ironsides, the oldest commissioned warship in the American fleet, required more than 120,000 pounds of hemp fiber just for its lines and rigging. A single vessel, more than 55 tons of fiber to rig one ship. The scale of hemp's importance to American naval power is difficult to overstate. This was the world that existed before 1937, a world in which hemp was not controversial, not exotic, not associated with any drug, simply a plant that did everything and was everywhere precisely because of it. Then the money moved in the other direction. To understand what happened in 1937, you need to understand what was happening in 1935. 2 years before the Marijuana Tax Act, the DuPont Chemical Company filed a patent for nylon, a synthetic fiber made from petrochemicals, strong, versatile, and, critically, patentable in a way that hemp fiber never could be. You cannot own a plant. You can own a chemical formula. Andrew Mellon, the Secretary of the Treasury under 3 successive presidents and one of the wealthiest men in America, had founded Gulf Oil and invested heavily in DuPont. Hemp, which could produce fiber, oil, fuel, and paper at a fraction of the cost of the petrochemical alternatives, was a direct threat to those investments. William Randolph Hearst owned the largest newspaper chain in the country and vast timber holdings that supplied the paper pulp his papers consumed. The USDA had documented in 1916 that hemp produced 4 times more cellulosic fiber per acre than trees. Hemp paper was a direct competitive threat to Hearst's timber empire. Harry Anslinger was the first director of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, a position he had built his career on during alcohol prohibition. When prohibition ended in 1933, Anslinger needed a new enemy to justify his bureau's existence and budget. He found one in marijuana, a Spanish-Mexican word for cannabis that the American public did not recognize and therefore did not associate with the hemp plant they had been growing for 3 centuries. This was not accidental. By using the term marijuana in legislation rather than hemp or cannabis, the bill's architects obscured what they were actually banning. Farmers who testified before Congress during the 1937 hearings described the law as a direct threat to the hemp fiber and seed industry. The American Medical Association opposed it. Congress passed it anyway. Routed through committees chaired by DuPont-aligned legislators, signed into law on August 2, 1937. The Marijuana Tax Act did not directly criminalize hemp. It required farmers to purchase a tax stamp to grow it. The stamps were almost impossible to obtain. To get the stamp, you had to already be growing hemp. To grow hemp legally, you needed the stamp. The circular requirement was a catch-22 that effectively made legal hemp cultivation impossible for any ordinary farmer. Within a decade, the American hemp industry had ceased to exist, except, and this is the part that reveals everything about the motives behind the ban, during World War II. When Japan cut off America's supply of Asian rope and canvas fiber, the same government that had made hemp impossible to grow released a film in 1942 called Hemp for Victory, urgently encouraging American farmers to grow it for the war effort. 400,000 acres were planted between 1942 and 1945. When the war ended, the program ended. The last commercial hemp fields in America were planted in 1957. The government knew exactly what hemp could do. It always had. It made the plant available when its military needed it and unavailable when its corporate allies needed the competition eliminated. Now let's talk about what hemp actually produces, because the fuel angle is only part of the story. Hemp seed contains 25 to 35% oil by weight. That oil can be processed directly into biodiesel through the same transesterification process used to make biodiesel from soybeans and canola. The hemp plant produces more oil per acre than most competing feedstocks and does it without the irrigation, synthetic fertilizer, and pesticide inputs that conventional biofuel crops demand. Hemp biomass, the stalks, leaves, and fiber material, can be converted into ethanol through fermentation, exactly as corn is converted to ethanol today. The difference: hemp produces more biomass per acre than corn, grows in virtually any climate, improves the soil it grows in rather than depleting it, and requires no synthetic nitrogen fertilizer because it builds soil fertility naturally. Henry Ford understood this. In 1925, he told the New York Times that the fuel of the future would come from farm crops, from fermented vegetable matter that any farmer could grow. His exact words, "The fuel of the future is going to come from fruit, like that sumac out by the road, or from apples, weeds, sawdust, almost anything. There is fuel in every bit of vegetable matter that can be fermented." There's enough alcohol in 1 year's yield of an acre of potatoes to drive the machinery necessary to cultivate the fields for 100 years. He was not being philosophical. He was describing an actual development program his engineers were running. Ford loved the American farmer. He saw agricultural fuel as a way to create a rural renaissance. Farms that produced not just food, but the energy that powered the entire economy, eliminating the dependence on imported petroleum that he recognized as a structural vulnerability. In 1941, Ford unveiled a prototype vehicle built partly from plant-based biocomposite material, including hemp fiber, soybeans, wheat, and flax, that was 30% lighter than steel and demonstrated 10 times the impact resistance. Popular Mechanics covered it in December 1941. The New York Times had covered it in February of the same year. Ford demonstrated the car's durability publicly by striking the body with an axe. The panel absorbed the blow and bounced back without denting. The fuel it ran on was hemp ethanol. Ford reportedly continued growing hemp on his estate after the 1937 ban, hoping to keep the vision commercially viable. He was not able to, not because the technology failed, but because the supply chain that would have fed it had been legislated out of existence 4 years before his prototype was built. Rudolf Diesel, who invented the diesel engine in 1897, designed it to run on vegetable oils. Peanut oil was his preferred demonstration fuel at the 1900 World Exhibition in Paris. His vision was a fuel that any farmer could produce from crops they grew themselves, a decentralized energy system in which no one held a monopoly on the input and no farmer was dependent on a corporation or a government for the energy to work his own land. Petroleum displaced that vision not because it was better technology, but because it was cheaper to extract from the ground in the early 20th century, and because the people extracting it had the capital and the political connections to make their version of energy the only option available. Hemp is not a fringe fuel alternative. It is the fuel alternative that the energy industry specifically needed to bury, and did. But fuel is still only one component of what makes this plant extraordinary. Hemp seed oil is edible. It contains an optimal ratio of omega-3 to omega-6 fatty acids, more balanced than flaxseed oil, with a flavor described as similar to sunflower oil. The seeds themselves are a complete protein source, containing all essential amino acids, and are eaten directly as food in dozens of countries where the plant was never banned. Hemp fiber is stronger than cotton and lasts longer. It was used for clothing, rope, canvas, and paper for thousands of years. Hempcrete, hemp fiber mixed with lime, is a building material with better insulating properties than concrete, lower carbon footprint than any conventional building material, and a structural strength that improves over decades as the lime carbonates. And the plant itself is a carbon sequestration machine. It absorbs 10 to 15 tons of CO2 per hectare as it grows, more per acre than most forest. It suppresses weeds through canopy density, eliminating herbicide needs. Its deep root system breaks up compacted soil, improves water infiltration, and reduces erosion. It improves the ground it grows in every season it is planted. One plant, fuel, food, fiber, building material, soil improvement, carbon sequestration, all from a crop that grows in 90 to 120 days and leaves the land better than it found it. Here is what you can do with this today. Industrial hemp was re-legalized at the federal level by the 2018 Farm Bill for plants containing less than 0.3% THC. You can grow it legally in most U.S. states with a state license or permit. Growing requirements vary. Check your state's Department of Agriculture before ordering seeds. But the barrier to entry is significantly lower than at any point since 1937. Several states have streamlined the licensing process to the point where a small-scale grower can be licensed and planting within a single growing season of deciding to start. Hemp is one of the easiest crops to establish. It requires no special soil preparation beyond what any garden bed can provide. It tolerates a wide range of climates. It has been grown successfully from Canada to the American Gulf Coast. it is naturally resistant to most pests and diseases, meaning no pesticide program is needed. It suppresses weeds through the density of its canopy, meaning no herbicide program is needed. It grows to 10 to 12 feet in a single season from seed. A quarter acre of hemp grown for seed, the most practical scale for a small landowner, yields enough oil for meaningful biodiesel production, enough to fuel small farm equipment, generators, and heating systems. The pressed cake left after oil extraction is a high-protein animal feed, comparable in nutritional profile to soybean meal. The fiber from the stalks can be sold to emerging hemp processing facilities used for on-farm composting or processed into hempcrete, a building material with better insulating properties than concrete and a fraction of its carbon footprint. The leaves and smaller plant material go into the compost that feeds next year's crop. One plant, fuel, food, fiber, building material, soil improvement, carbon sequestration, all from a crop that grows in 90 to 120 days and leaves the land better than it found it, in direct contrast to corn, which depletes the soil that grows it, or petroleum, which destroys the climate that sustains everything else. The startup cost for a quarter acre of hemp is modest. Quality seed, a state license where required, and basic growing infrastructure represent an investment that most small landowners can recover in the first season's harvest. Here is the honest part that most guides skip. Hemp is not a get-rich crop in its first year. The processing infrastructure for hemp, decorticators for fiber, oil presses for seed, markets for hemp biomass, is still rebuilding after 80 years of absence. You can grow excellent hemp and still struggle to find buyers for the raw output at a price that reflects its actual value. Direct sales channels, local markets, value-added products like hemp seed oil, hemp flour, and hempcrete building kits are where small-scale growers are finding the most viable economics right now. The fuel production from a quarter acre is real, but modest at that scale. Meaningful energy independence from hemp requires several acres of dedicated production. A quarter acre is an excellent starting point for learning the crop, building soil health, and establishing a growing practice, not yet a standalone fuel-independent solution. And growing hemp legally requires paperwork, a state license, annual registration, THC testing at harvest in most states. None of this is prohibitively complex, but it is more administrative overhead than growing tomatoes. 10 years from now, energy prices will be higher. The supply chains that deliver petroleum to your engine, your furnace, and your generator will have absorbed whatever volatility the next decade delivers and passed every cent of it directly to you. Some farmers in your region will have been growing hemp since 2020, building soil, pressing seed oil, selling fiber, running equipment on fuel they grew themselves. They will not be waiting for the next price spike to decide how much it costs to work their land. You will walk out to a stand of hemp 12 feet tall in the August heat, on a quarter acre that had never produced a crop worth harvesting before, growing on ground that needed no fertilizer, no irrigation, no chemicals of any kind. You will press the seeds. You will fill a container with oil your engine will run on, and you will understand, standing there, what Henry Ford understood in 1941, what the Virginia colonists understood in 1619, what every civilization that has ever grown this plant has always known. It was never complicated. It was never dangerous. It was just a plant that did everything, and therefore threatened everyone who needed you to believe that fuel, fiber, food, and energy could only come from sources they owned and controlled. The Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 was not about marijuana. It was about ensuring that a plant which had powered American civilization for 300 years could not compete with the patents that were being filed and the investments that were being made in the same legislative session. The 2018 Farm Bill gave it back. Most people do not know that yet. The knowledge is here. The plant is legal. The ground is waiting. If this opened something for you, if you can see that quarter acre differently now, subscribe so you don't miss the next system we uncover. Share this with someone who is still paying for what this plant has always been able to provide. The seed is available. The choice is yours.